Hi there, we will be getting started in 2 minutes time at the start of the hour. So if you want to get yourself settled down with a cup of tea, cup of coffee, we will be getting started in 2 minutes time. Okay, let's get started. The HelpSystems Data Security Suite allows organizations to communicate and collaborate securely, safe in the knowledge that none of their sensitive data is being inappropriately shared with people either inside or outside of the organization. In this session, we're going to take a look at how organizations such as yourselves can use the HelpSystems Data Security Suite to protect your sensitive data from both external and internal threats, avoid costly damage to reputation and legal fines, all while ensuring that these protections don't become a barrier to legitimate business processes or incur high management overheads. Now, to reduce background noise, we do have you all on mute. However, please feel free to use the questions panel to ask any questions as we go through the session. And we'll have a section at the end to pick up any questions that we don't kind of tick off as we're running through the session itself. After the session, if you have any further questions or if you'd like access to the recorded webinar, then please feel free to email info@helpsystems.com. Just a bit of background about myself. My name's Nick Hogg. I'm one of the directors of technical training here at HelpSystems. I've actually been with the organisation for over 16 years, and the majority of my time is spent with organisations like yourselves, helping them to understand how they can best use our data security suite to address their data loss prevention and compliance requirements. In terms of the structure of the session, we're going to start off by talking briefly about, what really makes data security quite tricky for some of the organizations we deal with. We'll have a bit of a look at some best practices we can put in place and the HelpSystems Data Security Suite and how it can assist with those best practices. And we'll use a few data protection use cases just to kind of help you maybe see in context how you can use the various solutions within the suite. Before we round off, just touching briefly on our HelpSystems One vision for the future. Now, we are going to focus predominantly on our data security suite today, so all the icons in blue here, but don't discount our wider vulnerability and management and offensive security solutions because they can make up part of our larger picture when it comes to enforcing security around our sensitive data. Because with the infrastructure protection suite, that essentially gives you the ability to run the scans that will identify the vulnerabilities in your systems and your applications. And with that, you can then drill in and really start to understand which of those vulnerabilities are exploitable today, which maybe helps you to prioritize how to best address those. We can go all the way to the full kind of red team exercises, and we've got services that can deliver that, but we've also got our own software that you can use to investigate what's going to happen if somebody does try to breach one of these vulnerabilities to get your sensitive data, so that you can start to put in place some additional layers of protection to deal with those risks. Let's start off then by talking about why data security itself can be so tricky for organizations. I think typically when we're talking to organizations about data loss prevention or compliance projects, their concerns fall into three key areas. The first of those is around stopping the external risks getting into the organization. So it's how do we stop the ransomware, the spyware getting into the business to steal our sensitive data or just limit our ability to access our infrastructure and our data. Increasingly, organizations are actually getting quite concerned about some of the very kind of sophisticated phishing attacks that they're seeing, just trying to trick their employees into voluntarily, sharing sensitive data outside of the organization or maybe paying a false invoice or something like that. The second area organizations typically have the concerns around is with the data loss prevention side of it. And you can absolutely put in place the mechanisms that will start to reduce the risk of the malicious insiders within an organization. But actually, when you look at a lot of the data loss events that occur, the majority of them are people just making a simple mistake. It's somebody clicking on the wrong name in Outlook autocomplete and sending some sensitive information outside of the organization to an inappropriate recipient. And you can absolutely put in place the controls to start to mitigate those kind of accidental data losses. And then the last area organizations have the concerns in is that kind of overarching shadow of compliance. It's the GDPRs, it's the HIPAAs, the PCIs of the world that really are putting a lot more focus onto how we handle our sensitive information, how we share it internally and externally, and all the controls that we put around that. We recently ran a survey of about 250 chief information security officers for financial services firms worldwide, and the results of that kind of mirrored what we see, anecdotally when we're talking to organizations. And one of the key things that jumped out was around concerns around data visibility. And talking to the CISOs, it almost falls into two areas. The first of these is they've got the people and the processes in place that kind of set out how sensitive data should be handled and shared as an organization. But the CISOs kind of had concerns that they didn't feel they had the full level of visibility that they wanted into all the data flows and the repositories and so on that would give them the confidence that their employees are actually following the processes. The second part of it is it's almost information overload. It's getting too much data, and what they're maybe finding is that their existing DLP and compliance suites are generating too many false positives, and that's overloading the compliance teams and the security teams. And their real concern is that they're potentially missing some of the real data risks against a background sea of noise. And I think when we look at the traditional approach to data security, it's very focused around infrastructure control, but it doesn't matter how well locked down your data center is, how well controlled the access to the applications and the data is. At some point, we have to give a certain subset of our trusted employees access to that data to do their job. And that's where the risk of potentially the accidental data breach creeps into play. So I think ideally, we really should be looking at how we can protect the data throughout its entire life cycle, from the point that it's created through the various mechanisms that we use to share it, all the way to the point that it's outside of our control and in the hands of our business partners and our customers and so on. So what I want to do is move on to talk about a few sort of data security best practices. And every organization we talk to, even those in the same vertical, can often have some very vastly differing sets of requirements when it comes to data security. So there's not really a one-size-fits-all solution here, but I do think that there are some general best endeavors principles that we can apply to start to mitigate some of these risks. And I really do believe that using a layered approach to our data security still makes a huge amount of sense, even as we move more and more of that data into the cloud, because by using different detection and mitigation techniques, we can provide resilience for those instances when maybe a system or a manual process becomes compromised, because we have all of these other systems and mechanisms in place to catch the breach before it escalates into a full-on data loss or a compliance event. Now, we could easily talk at great length about each one of these layers, and maybe as you've seen from that earlier portfolio diagram, HelpSystems has got a huge range of solutions that can assist all of these different layers here. But what I just want to focus on for today's session is around the data security and the human layer, because we often hear that people are the weakest link in any cybersecurity posture, but they can also be our greatest asset if we can only just work out how to use them most effectively. And I think people, processes, and technology all play a key role when it comes to enforcing an effective data security strategy. And maybe historically, vendors have been a little bit too keen to paint this picture that their solution is the complete answer to all of your data security requirements. But really, that's just a complete nonsense. There isn't a single silver technological bullet that's going to address all of these requirements. But if we can get that balance right between the people, the processes, and the technology, using the technology as an electronic backstop for those times that the people and the processes maybe fail us, then that's where I think we can get a much more effective wrapper of security around our sensitive data. I think on the people side of things, you know, these things always need to be driven from the top. It needs to come from the CEO, the board level down, because if it's been driven by the CEO, then it's much harder for people within the organization to just assume that data security is somebody else's requirements. And we can use training here to help people to start to understand that they should be handling sensitive data in an appropriate manner. What I would kind of encourage with my training background is, you know, these once a year big kind of security and compliance training events, they're okay as a tick box exercise, but with the best will in the world, unless somebody's job revolves around data security and compliance, 9, 10, 11 months after they've been through that training, can we really confidently say that security will be at the forefront of their mind? So I think the most effective strategies I've seen have been this kind of little and often approach. Maybe you just choose one topic a month to focus on, put out a short, 3-minute video or something like that, focusing on phishing or ransomware or whatever. And if you can put it in a context where it's not just how is it relevant to the employee as part of the organization, but how do the same principles apply to their personal data and their own kind of laptops and stuff at home to avoid them falling for a phishing attack? Training is effective, but people do still make mistakes, and people don't always pay the most attention during the training. So there's other things we can do to help to identify areas where we need a little bit more education around. So we can run maybe simulated phishing tests with things like our Fish Labs products, where we can do a phishing run on the employees to understand who's maybe going to be a little bit more susceptible to certain types of attacks, and then you can do more targeted training around that. But it's not just about kind of formal training. If we look at things like data classification solutions, I think they're a very effective tool when it comes to kind of subtly educating users over time, because with visible markings, you can kind of constantly remind them of the sensitivity of certain pieces of data that they're handling. If you can involve them in the classification process as well, then actually what happens over time is you see this trend where the number of data loss and compliance events will decrease because you've done that kind of subtle education. With the process side of things, I think obviously we need to make sure that the processes are very easy to understand and very clear to remove any kind of room for ambiguity. But it sometimes feels, as an employee, you can feel that you're being dictated to and being told that you have to change how you're doing your job because of security or compliance. What I see that works quite effectively from our perspective when we're doing consultancy is when we're talking to organizations, when we're talking to departments within the organizations, it's actually just about understanding where they've got problems today. And if we can show them that we're going to give them a solution that will make their lives a little bit easier, at the same time build in the security and the compliance controls, then that's where you see the kind of adoption of these solutions is much more successful. And then the last piece there is that technology piece. And as I said, it's not your total answer here. It has to be a part of it. It has to be there to complement the people. And in the event that maybe somebody makes a mistake, that's where the technology is your electronic backstop. In the event that somebody doesn't follow a process, or it's a little bit too tricky to follow, again, that's maybe where the technology comes into play to catch that event before it escalates into something much more severe. When we approach our DLP projects and our compliance projects, we typically break them into 3 phases. And the first of these is around understanding what the sensitive data is. And I think this is quite a useful step, because when we can recognize that not all of the data within an organization is created as equal, and when you can identify the sensitive data, then you can make sure that you're wrapping the appropriate security controls around that to ensure that that data can only be shared with the right people inside and outside of the organization, while at the same time you don't throw any unnecessary barriers into the way of the employees that are going about their more kind of legitimate day-to-day business processes. Once you've identified that sensitive data, that's where you can start to put the controls into play to govern how that's been accessed, how it's been shared within the environment, how it's been shared outside of the organization, to make sure that only the appropriate recipients are receiving it. And then lastly, we do have to recognize that we do have to share this sensitive data more and more outside of the organization as we outsource more services and so on. So that's where we can ensure that when we're sharing the data appropriately, we can also use things like encryption within emails or digital rights management to keep data in transit, secure in transit, or keep data secure even once it's outside of our kind of traditional network boundary in the hands of our users. And there's a number of elements here that I think can really go into putting an effective set of controls around our sensitive information. We can use data classification to identify what that sensitive information is and involve the end users in the process. And once you've identified that sensitive information, you can use the DLP controls within your email traffic at the endpoint, in the managed file transfer and the web traffic, to really start to hone in and ensure that that sensitive data is protected appropriately without those unnecessary barriers to the communications. I think ransomware often gets a lot of attention, but actually it's the humble phishing emails that are potentially the biggest problem for a lot of organizations. I think about 90%, 96% of phishing attacks still happen over the corporate mail systems, or at least the first approach happens over a corporate mail system. So we can use our email security solutions to start to mitigate the risk of the phishing attacks coming into the organizations, or the ransomware, the spyware coming into the business over the mail system. But we can enforce the same policies across web traffic, managed file transfer, and all of these other kind of contact points with the outside world. We see managed file transfer is becoming more and more of a popular requirement from organizations, because they might have, compliance mandates that actually say, well, if you're sharing healthcare data, PCI, et cetera, out of the organization, it must be done using, secure protocols and secure encrypted platforms and encrypted data. I think MFT is brilliant because it gives you an easy to use mechanism for users to share files that are potentially too large to share over a corporate mail system with third parties. It also potentially gives you something where you might be a little bit concerned about users putting things into cloud services, because maybe you have data sovereignty requirements where the data has to sit within certain geographical boundaries, and the users maybe don't always appreciate where that data will actually live within the cloud. So something like an MFT system can give you the ability to deliver the equivalent of a Dropbox or a OneDrive service, but one that you own, that you have full visibility of. You can inject your DLP and your compliance controls into, to make sure that if that's been used to share data, it's only being used to share data appropriately with the correct recipients. And we'll also touch a little bit on some of the automation processes within MFT, because I think automation can be very powerful, where it gives you the opportunity to potentially take humans out of the loop from those kind of repetitive tasks. So maybe frees them up to focus on other, more value add tasks for you as an organization. But also by taking the humans out of the loop, you reduce, some of the room for error that the human can make there. And then lastly, you have the digital rights management piece. And I think DRM is becoming more and more of a requirement for the organizations we talk to, because it could be that you need to share your intellectual property with a business partner, sensitive details with a business partner or a customer, but you're maybe concerned that that could then be forwarded on to somebody who shouldn't be able to access that data. So with the digital rights management, we don't just encrypt the data, but you can actually wrap access control lists to say who is able to access the data, and permission lists to say what they can do with it. Can they only view it for a week? Can they print it off? Can they edit it? So it really gives you a very fine-grained level of control of that information, even once it's outside of the corporate network. And that could be, if you're sharing it with remote workers and home workers, where they're potentially accessing it on a personal device where you can't necessarily guarantee the integrity of that device. But also it can be, when you've shared something with a business partner and customer, and you just want to make sure that that can't then be forwarded on to an inappropriate recipient. So what I want to do now is move on and talk to you a little bit about the HelpSystems Data Security Suite and how it can be an integral part of your overall sort of data security and compliance policies. And it's worth pointing out that just delivering a kind of comprehensive and a powerful suite to you is hugely important, but there's no point in us doing that if it's too hard for you to use it effectively. So one of our key guiding principles is around operational simplicity. If we can deliver solutions to you that are easy to use and allow you to deploy flexible policies that don't get in the way of your employees doing their jobs, then you are so much more likely to see the good levels of risk mitigation that you're looking for. And it's also worth stressing that the word suite can sometimes feel a little bit daunting because it feels like you have to buy all of the bits of that in order to get the benefit. But that is absolutely not the case here. We have designed our data security suite to be entirely modular. So you can choose those components that allow you to address the immediate business issues that you have alongside your existing infrastructure, your projects, your timescales, your budgets, and so on. But you can do that safe in the knowledge that in the future, if you choose to deploy additional solutions from HelpSystems, you can take advantage of the integrations between those different solutions to further enhance your data security and your compliance controls, but do it in a way where maybe you're not increasing the management overhead or the end user manual processes and so on. And we recognize that you will already have significant investments in third-party solutions within your environment. So we work very nicely alongside a whole host of these third-party solutions. So if you're already using Microsoft 365, where you're using the sensitivity markings to enforce a classification policy within the organization, that's perfectly fine. We can use those Microsoft 365 sensitivity markings within our email security solutions, our MFT solutions, our DLP solutions to trigger policy elements within there. If you've got SIEM solutions like the Splunks and the ArcSights of the world, then again, we are well set up for passing the data around policy violations across to those solutions as well. Now, we're not saying that we're the complete answer here, but we do see that we can be this integral part of anyone's overall data security strategy, complementing your processes and being there as a last line of defense in the event that one of your employees makes a mistake or doesn't follow a process. So you can use the data classification solutions to identify what your sensitive information is, where it lives within the network, and ensure that the right classification markings are associated with that data. And then we can start to wrap the security controls around that data to ensure that it's only being shared with the right people inside and outside of the business. With the email security solutions, you can use those to guard against these external threats, the malware, the phishing attacks coming into the organization, but you can also use the integrated DLP capabilities there to look for the classification markings, to look for the sensitive words and phrases, and then start to enforce your kind of DLP and compliance policies within the mail flow. Our MFT solutions really are like a Swiss Army knife. They give you that kind of end user ad hoc initiated sort of file transfers for files that are potentially too large to email, where the mechanism to share the data, the platform and the data itself are all encrypted. But because the DLP controls can plug in there, you can make sure that that doesn't become a vector for a data loss or a compliance event. You can also make sure that the MFT traffic doesn't become the way for malware or ransomware to get into the organization. The data loss prevention side of things, one of our more recent acquisitions is Digital Guardian, and they're such a powerful tool from a DLP perspective because we can deploy both at the endpoint level, but also into the network traffic to really understand very quickly what the employees are doing today in terms of how they're accessing and sharing the data, where the data lives within the environment, and then we can start to enforce the policies around, reporting, blocking, encrypting, or whatever, moving the sensitive data into the right area of the network from maybe a more publicly accessible location. And then lastly, we have Vera for the digital rights management piece. And that gives us that very powerful tool, not just to encrypt the data, but to wrap the access control lists and the permission lists around the file to make sure that only the appropriate people are able to access it and to control what they can actually do with that file. So let's drill down now and talk about each one of these solutions in a little bit more depth before we kind of look at the scenarios and how they can be used within some of the customers today. With the data classification solutions, they give us a number of things. They give us the ability to put those visible markings into the documents and the files to kind of help remind a user that a certain piece of information needs to be handled securely. You can involve the end users in the classification process with plugins into common applications like Word, into mail clients like Outlook, or into even things like AutoCAD packages and so on, so that when a user is working on something or receives a document, they can classify that document. That's very useful because typically you would expect the users to understand what the sensitivity of this data is, and by involving in that process, you help to do that kind of subtle education that I was talking about earlier. But we do recognize that people can make mistakes. So that manual classification process is backed up by our machine learning. And we can potentially identify maybe where a user has misclassified some healthcare information, for example, and we can ensure that not only does the right level of classification actually get applied to the file, but that we also can do some of that end user education at that point to ensure that they are potentially not going to make the same mistake in the future. One of the kind of areas of concern when we talk to some organizations about data classification is, well, you know what, we've got terabytes of data in our environment, and classifying all of that manually will take a while. And yeah, that's absolutely the case, which is why we've also got our automated solutions as well. So we can crawl the local drives of the users, we can crawl the network shares, we can crawl the corporate cloud storage, we can identify the sensitive data, we can make sure that the right level of classification is applied to that, and we can also move it from maybe an area where it shouldn't be into a more secure area within the environment. So between that kind of end user classification, backed up by the machine learning and backed up by the automated discovery, then that really allows you to ensure that you're getting the right level of classification applied to the sensitive data within the organization, and then you can really wrap the appropriate security controls around that data. With our email security solutions, they give us the ability to guard against these external risks. So we have our kind of more traditional secure email gateway that can sit at the boundary of the organization's mail flow, and we can help to guard against these very sort of nasty and emergent ransomware and spyware risks as they're coming into the organization. The integrated DLP controls within there can also help to kind of guard against the data loss and the compliance events. I'll touch on those in a second. But it could be that you've already got a bunch of boundary email security in place, but potentially you're seeing phishing messages making it into your users' mailboxes that are a little bit concerning from your perspective. And that's where our Agari solution comes into play, because our Agari solution can plug in at the mailbox level. It can use the host of threat feeds that we have access to, backed up by the intelligence that we gain from looking at all the traffic patterns within our customer mail flows, and backed up by a machine learning model. So we can really start to find those kind of business email compromise messages, those account takeover messages that are kind of often quite tricky to get, but that could be the one where somebody's masquerading as one of your business partners, trying to trick one of your employees into paying a false invoice or sharing some sensitive data outside of the organization. So with the email security solutions, we can sit at the boundary, we can stop the ransomware, the malware coming in, but we can also sit at the mailbox level to look at the things that maybe made it past your existing email defenses to give yourself this additional layer of protection within there. And then we can also look at the outbound traffic and the internal email traffic to ensure that the sensitive information is only going to the right people, both inside and outside of the business. And that could be based upon the classification markings. But we've also got the kind of language analysis, all the pre-configured tokens for PII and PCI that would let you identify maybe where there's some sensitive data that hasn't yet been classified but needs to be handled in an appropriate mechanism. And we can potentially extend your detection capabilities, so that scan of a legal contract or of a medical record that could quite happily sail through Microsoft 365 without getting picked up. we can pick up because we've got the optical character recognition that can extract the text out of scanned documents and imagery to identify where there's something sensitive within there. And as well as the more standard sort of stop and block and encryption mechanisms, we've also got our redaction and our sanitization controls that maybe give you the mechanisms to reduce some of the data risk, but do it in a much less intrusive way than some of the other solutions that are out there. So it could be that we see something in Appendix D of a document that looks like a social security number, rather than just blocking that and potentially delaying a legitimate business communication. We can go in there, and if policy dictates, we can redact out that one thing that violates the policy. Once we're happy that there's nothing else within there that poses a data risk or a compliance risk, we can allow the rest of that communication to go on its way. And that allows you to be kind of quite proactive about the policies you're putting in place, because you're not going to see a kind of spike in terms of the management overhead around false positives and delays to legitimate business communications. We've also got the integrated encryption features. So it could be that you're sharing healthcare data with a customer or sensitive financial information or IP with a business partner. We've got the ability to perform the automated encryption within there. So we can maybe identify, based upon where the traffic's coming from, where it's going to, or based upon the content of the traffic, that this data is going to an approved recipient, even though it's sensitive data, but we need to automatically encrypt that to keep it secure in transit. And if it's the kind of business to consumer model where you're a bank or a healthcare provider talking to customers, we have our encryption portal. If it's the more kind of business to business model where maybe you're a financial organization sharing something with your underwriters, then that's where we've got the PGPs, the S-MIMEs, the password protected zips there. The key thing from my point of view is, though, this can all be done automatically, so you're not asking a user to remember to press a button or write something into a subject line, because they might forget to do these things. So we can be there again to catch that and make sure that things are encrypted where appropriate. The MFT solutions, like I said, they're like this amazing Swiss Army knife. They give you that ability to maybe do something very simple in terms of, we've got a file that's too large to email. We need a simple mechanism to share this with a business partner or customer. Then that could be something as simple as giving your users a button in Outlook to press to send this oversized file through our secure file transfer platform. But because that is a secure platform, because the data is encrypted, because you get all the audit controls within there, there's a number of other things you can do as well. If you want to give the users that kind of equivalent of a OneDrive or a Dropbox account, but where you want full visibility of the data sharing, you want to scan the data to make sure that there's no compliance violations within there, or there's no potential for ransomware to come into the organization, then that's where, again, a secure file transfer platform can assist you. And then the automation capabilities are very powerful. Could be that maybe if you're a bank and you're sharing customer details with an insurance underwriter, and you have to do that once an hour, once a day, or whatever. Maybe you want to replace some kind of homegrown scripts where you maybe don't necessarily get full visibility of when those transfers happen. Then you can use the secure file transfer platform to pull the data out of the CRM, to encrypt it, pass it across to the business partner, but also to inspect the data to make sure that there's nothing within there that might pose a violation for the organization. So you're making sure that the right data is going to the right recipient there, and you get the full kind of audit controls for compliance purposes within that. The endpoint solution is a really powerful tool. I like this tool. It gives you the ability to deploy both at the endpoint onto Windows platforms, Mac OS, and Linux, but we can also drop into the network flow to do the data in use piece. So we can look at, is a user trying to copy a file onto a USB stick or into a network share where this type of data shouldn't be going. We can stop them from potentially uploading customer details to a Dropbox account. And we can also drop into that network traffic to look at the email flow, to look at the web traffic, to look at the MFT flow, to make sure that there's nothing sensitive being shared within an appropriate recipient. And both at the endpoint level and at the network level, we can do the data discovery. So we can scan the local drives, we can scan the network shares, we can scan the cloud storage to find the sensitive information and report on that or potentially move that to a secure location within there. And one of the nice pieces of integration we have is our data classification solution is integrated with our Digital Guardian DLP solution. So Digital Guardian can be set to do a scan. If it finds something that's sensitive, contains healthcare data, it can then go and it can write the classification tags into the alternate data stream without any kind of user intervention at that point. From your perspective, actually, one of the nice features here is when you deploy Digital Guardian, it's deployed essentially in a monitoring mode where there's already a huge number of pre-configured policies that's going to be looking for a host of these kind of data loss or compliance risks. So that can really help you to build up a picture of, what are my users doing today with this sensitive information? Where does my sensitive information live within the environment? And then you can then use that to make a very informed decision when it comes to turning the policy into an enforcement mode of where do we block, where do we encrypt, where do we allow these types of transfers. And then the last component there is the digital rights management piece, because that DRM piece is the ability that allows us to extend the controls to the data once it's outside of our environment. So we don't just apply the AES 256 encryption to the file, we wrap the access control list around the file to say who is able to access that. And we verify that at the point that the user tries to access it. So there's a call into our cloud service to see, has this user got access? That does mean that you can revoke access on the fly. So if you suddenly decide a week after you've shared something with a business partner that you don't want them to be able to view that data anymore, it's a couple of clicks to remove their ability to access that data anymore. You've also got the ability to set a permission list. So you can say, well, I will share this with this business partner for a week and it's read only, so they can only see that data. They won't be able to print it or copy and paste text out of it. Or you can give them full editing controls where appropriate. So many of the organizations we deal with, they really appreciate the value of this DRM piece because it does allow you to start to fill one of those gaps where in the past you've just had to trust that the recipient won't necessarily do something inappropriate with the data you share with them. So that's a ridiculously high level overview of all the solutions there. We could spend hours on each one of those solutions. What I want to do now is really just use a few scenarios to show how customers have been able to use the solutions to address some of their data security requirements. In the first one here, when we talk to organizations about the data security side of things, they can often have some really sort of differing sets of requirements and different infrastructure and budgets and so on. In this case here, we've got a defence organisation, a defence contractor, who are working on some very large-scale defence contracts where they have to collaborate with third parties. And the information they need to share with them is this, falls under this International Trafficking in Arms Regulations, or ITAR for short. The issue they've had, though, is that they also work on a whole number of commercial contracts with other contractors, and they've had this systematic series of data breaches where this ITAR data has accidentally been shared with the commercial contractors who have no right to be seeing this type of data. And it's kind of escalated to a point where their local Department of Defence has told them they have to get their house in order. So they've taken a very considered approach. They started off by replacing their manual data classification processes that are a little bit error prone with our data classification solution, where they can involve the end users, they can back that up with the machine learning and the automated discovery to ensure that their ITAR data is classified appropriately. And at this point, they're able to take advantage of one of the integration points between our solutions, because you can set up policies within the data classification solutions that say, well, as soon as a user or the automated discovery mechanism classifies a file as ITAR related, then we can automatically apply the digital rights management to the file without any kind of manual user intervention there. And that's a very powerful tool because they've been able to identify the ITAR data, and immediately they've ensured that the DRM has been applied to the file so that they can share it outside of the organization, confident that only the approved recipients will be able to access that data. Now, they've deployed our email security solutions because typically this type of information has been shared across the corporate mail flow. The data may not just be within the attachment, there might be something ITAR related in the body of the message. So we can look for the classification tag in the attachment to recognize that this is going to an approved recipient and allow the communication. We can look for the ITAR data in the body of the message and recognize that maybe we need an additional layer of encryption on the message body itself to keep that ITAR data secure in transit. And importantly, we can make sure that that ITAR data doesn't get accidentally shared with an unauthorized recipient. Because some of these files are a little bit too large to email, AutoCAD files and so on, then they also deployed our managed file transfer platform, our secure file transfer platform, that gave them that secure, auditable platform for sharing the data with the authorized business partners. But again, because our DLP controls were plugged in there, we could look for the classification tags to make sure that that ITAR data was only being shared with the approved recipients. And if we could maybe see that there was some information there that hadn't yet been classified, hadn't yet been identified as ITAR data, and had the DRM applied to that, the secure file transfer platform could automatically apply the DRM before it was shared with the business partners. So the right people get the data, but if they were to then forward that on to an unapproved recipient, that unauthorized recipient simply would not be able to access that information. Sometimes, though, we speak to organizations that really have to make some very immediate changes to deal with some burning issues that they're seeing, but they potentially want to build on the foundations that they put in place in the future. And in this case here, we have got a healthcare provider in Germany who had a series of systematic data breaches, because they obviously have to share healthcare information with other hospitals, with insurance companies and so on, but they'd had a series of breaches where this healthcare information had just been shared with people who shouldn't be able to see it. And they were getting a lot of pressure from their local information commissioner's office to fix this very, very quickly. So they took a phased approach. In phase one, they looked at how this data was typically shared across the corporate mail systems. They deployed our email security solutions into the corporate mail flow. We could look for the healthcare data. When we saw that it was going to another hospital, going to an insurance company, or some other kind of authorized recipient, we could encrypt that to keep it secure in transit. If we saw that it was being shared with an unauthorized recipient, we could block it or redact it in line with the corporate policy. Again, they also had issues where some of the files that they needed to share were too large to email, medical imaging files, MRI scans, and so on. So they deployed our managed file transfer platform to give them that secure platform for their end users to easily share these oversized files. But again, our DLP controls are plugged in there to make sure that the healthcare data is only going to the authorized recipients. And that was phase one. It allowed them to go back to the information commissioner's office and show them they had taken some very meaningful steps to address their data and compliance risks. In phase two, they went off, they deployed our data classification solutions to make sure that all of the healthcare information within the environment was classified appropriately, but they could do that safe in the knowledge that the managed file transfer, the DLP, the email security solutions that they'd already deployed would simply be able to use these additional classification tags to further enhance the policy. And then the last scenario here came from a police force, actually, but I think it's kind of similarly applicable to healthcare and financial organizations and a whole host of organizations where you maybe want to give members of the public a mechanism to share files with you, but you're concerned that that might be the mechanism that brings the ransomware or the spyware into the organization. So in this case here, the police force wanted an easy to use mechanism for a member of the public to maybe upload dash cam footage or CCTV footage, or maybe a scan of a driving license to them. They deployed our managed file transfer solution to give them that easy to use web portal for the members of the public. They could go there, they could upload the file, they could put in a case reference number and some other pieces of information. The automation in the background could make sure that that data was stored in the right areas of the network and the right systems. They could make sure that the investigating officer was notified about us receiving that type of data. But they also deployed our DLP controls within there to provide that layer of hygiene to make sure that this wasn't a vector for the malware or the ransomware to get into the organization. With the Crown Prosecution Service and so on, judges and so on. And they just wanted an easy to use mechanism for that data to be shared securely, but they also wanted to be able to inspect the data to make sure that there was nothing sensitive going to an inappropriate recipient across that managed file transfer traffic. So those three scenarios together have hopefully kind of helped to set out how you can use the data security suite, and the modular nature of that potentially gives you the option to just really pick and choose those solutions that will allow you to address your immediate business concerns, but it does give you opportunities in the future to really start to deploy additional solutions and take advantage of the integrations between them. And all of that's what we have today. One last message about the kind of the future for HelpSystems is we're working on this HelpSystems One project, and the goal with the HelpSystems One project is really to give you a single common user interface and a single sign-on for you to manage all of the data security solutions within there. So one point to go to get access to the email security, the data classification, all the management controls, and also that centralized point of visibility within there. Now, as I said, that's not something. It's very early days for HelpSystems One. We've got a couple of the projects, the products integrated in there today, but the goal as we go forward with all the solutions you've seen today, but also with all the ones that will be coming down the pike in terms of our acquisitions to give you additional options there, will be to eventually give you this single point of management and visibility with all the solutions there. So in summary then, our data security suite allows organizations to understand what their sensitive data is and where it lives within their network, to govern how that data has been shared, to ensure that it's only shared with the right people both inside and outside of the organization, and lastly, to protect that data, to ensure that when it's been shared appropriately, it's also been shared securely. So I'm just going to have a quick look at the questions. I've been trying to tick them off as we've been going through here, but let me just take another look and see if there's any I've missed. In the meantime, feel free to ask any additional questions that you might have of me. Okay, so I can see there's a question around the secure file transfer in terms of, we've got three solutions listed under the secure file transfer, and actually it's kind of applicable when you look at data classification and email security. Is there a recommended one? One of the nice things about the data security suite is what we've tried to do when we've chosen the solutions as part of our kind of development and our acquisition process is really start to give you a range of choices. So rather than just saying we've got a single solution for secure file transfer, we've got a single solution for email security, we've got a single solution for data classification, and really just kind of trying to fit your requirements into that kind of straitjacket. Really, what it allows us to do is be much more kind of consultative about these things, where we can kind of understand what your requirements are, understand what your existing infrastructure looks like, and really recommend out of those range of solutions which one's going to be the most appropriate one for you today, but also what might be the best one, with a view to kind of future projects going there. So there's not one that we would typically say choose that over this. It really just gives us a range of options based upon some of the requirements you might have within there. I can see there's a question about the email security side of things, and kind of how's it delivered, how's it hosted. With the email security gateway, then the choice is kind of up to you. You can deploy that yourself on premise, both in kind of physical or virtual infrastructure like VMware and Hyper-V. You can spin that up in the cloud. We've got instances in the AWS store. You can deploy as into your Microsoft Azure deployment. We also have a managed service that we can provide for you. So it really is up to you on the email gateway side what you would want to achieve there. For the Agari side of things, that is a cloud-hosted solution, and we use essentially sensors that will be deployed within your environment to tap into the mail flow at the mailbox level. We can work, if you're on-premise Exchange, we can integrate Agari with that. If you're Microsoft 365, if you're G Suite, again, we can integrate Agari with that. So we're kind of quite flexible from that point of view, but the kind of management piece and all the kind of intelligence within there is hosted by ourselves, and the only bit that would be within your infrastructure would be the sensors that we integrate within there. Let me just troll through these again. Okay, oh, there's maybe a chat. Cool. Okay, so I think I've ticked off all of the questions as we've gone through. If you do have any other questions after the session, or I can see Brooke has put the link to the data security use cases into the chat here. That's also up on the slide. Then feel free to drop an email through to info@helpsystems.com, especially if you need any additional questions answered, or if you'd like to see a demo and maybe talk specifically about your requirements there. Those data security use cases, it touches on the ones we've used, but actually there's a whole range of other ones listed on there as well. So with that, I will thank you very much for your time. It's been very much appreciated. If you have any additional questions, let us know. And with that, the HelpSystems Data Security Suite allows organizations to communicate and collaborate securely, safe in the knowledge that none of their sensitive data is being inappropriately shared with people either inside or outside of the organization.